Morning. The mic is fixed. So I don't know about you, but what a first day. At large academic gatherings, my own energy level seems to dissipate on the second day or the third day, and it just keeps on dropping. But this clearly is different, and I hope that you all feel the same. Yesterday, our speakers have all been so thought-provoking and made us think. To think about the challenges and issues in education that range from the moral obligations to the commercial incentives, from the practical side to the policy side, from the academic and the more esoteric interests to the hands-on and out in the field kind, from our own US-based experiences to those from the international perspective. And many more questions were raised and there were time for answers. But on this second day of our conference, we bring together the collective experiences of those of us who have been nibbling away at these large issues. We hope to learn from these projects, applications, and implementations the lessons that we may each bring home to solve our own problems in creative and evidence-based ways. So without further ado, let me introduce Alan Kay, President of the Viewpoints Research Institute. So enjoy the second day of the conference and ask even more questions.
Well, it's always great to get a short introduction, because a long one is not going to help a bad talk. So this title is something I said a long time ago when I worked for Xerox, but it was actually picked by the conference organizers. And I thought about changing the title to something that probably wouldn't go on my tombstone. But I thought, yeah, why not? Build a talk around this. But of course, there are easier ways of predicting the future than invention. One of the easiest ways to predict the future is just to prevent it. Most of the futures that we live in are so incremental to the present and have been prevented so well that, and education, I think this is a good title also. We'd like to kind of do that, but this keeps on creeping back in, because everybody loves change except for the change part. People talk about change forever, but they start digging their heels in once you start doing it. So in my research community, which now goes back quite a few decades, ARPA, O&R, Office Naval Research, Xerox PARC, we had a number of ways of dealing with the tyranny of the present. The present is so vivid. We're in it right now, and this is the worst possible way of doing it because we're around a campfire the way we were 200,000 years ago. That's crazy if you think about it. One of the things I thought about doing for this talk was actually writing something that's more than I could say in 40 minutes and trying to get everybody to read it. Most people can read three to five times faster than they can listen, and most people remember better, and so forth. So the problem here is when we're trapped in here, as we are today, we're set up perfectly for news. This is what people exchange with each other. News defined as things where there are only the categories that we walked in the door with. If you think about news on television, it's this war, that bombing, this good deed. They never change the categories. And the reason is that learning a new category is something you can't do in 20 minutes or 40 minutes. This is a problem with the talk about the future, because an interesting future is about new categories. So one of the things we did there was, and this is, I commend this to you, is assume something favorable that's moderately exponential. We had integrated circuits to look at and what is now called Moore's law. And given that, if you have a whisper of a need, the kind of thing that would get knocked down by any considerations like what you might have to put in an NSF proposal these days, which is exactly how you're going to do this brand new thing, which has to be completely old or it won't get through the reviewers. It's complete bullshit if you think about it, but everybody is comfortable with it except me. So I don't take money from NSF. But a whisper of need and this upward roller coaster, we can just project that need out 30 years so far that we don't have to worry about how we get out there. But from 30 years in the future, we can say about this whisper, would it be ridiculous if we didn't have this in 30 years? So for instance, I did this with the idea of the laptop in the late 60s. There wasn't even a personal computer then. But I thought it'd be good for children to have laptops, actually tablets, and projecting it out 30 years, it was absolutely a slam dunk. No question it's going to happen. And once you get that, you can come up with a vision. And a vision is not the same thing as a mission or goals. A vision is a vague picture of a desirable future state of affairs. So in the ARPA community, for instance, it was that we want to have a worldwide self-healing network that can connect to every person on the planet. Nobody knew how to do that in the early 60s. And we want to have interactive computing in a way that can serve as an interactive intellectual amplifier. Not just something to consume media on, but something that will help us think and help us learn. Those are two ideals from the early 60s. Have no idea how to do them. But what you do next is you pull that vision into a lesser vision that's 10 to 15 years out and look at it carefully. And the cool thing about these favorable curves is that in almost every case over the last 200 years, if you want to live 10 to 15 years in the future, you can pay for it. You just have to pay 10 to 20 times as much. So what we did at Xerox PARC was to build the Macintosh of 1988 and 1973. And in today's dollars, instead of costing a couple of $1,000s, as it did in the late 80s, it cost about $125,000, and we built 2,000 of them. It's just a matter of money, because that's part of the message of what technology and the Industrial Revolution is about. And having done that, now you're suddenly faced with the ability to compute in the future, and now you have the chance to invent the software, and you have the time to invent the software. So you'll get something that isn't news by the time you get done. Then you start crawling your way there. So this is one way to do it. This is what education needs. They took a shot at it in the 60s, came a cropper, but they did have a good 10 years in there. And people who are familiar with that history should try to understand what it actually took to do seriously really good curriculum and teacher training. So we have to ask, what is it that we should actually be working on? And I'd like to dedicate this talk to three great minds that we lost this year. First one, Marvin Minsky. One of his sayings was, you don't understand something if you only understand it one way. This is a radical, this will get you thrown out of any elementary school in the country. Jerome Brunner. These people are all personal friends, so it was a shock to have them all go this year. Jerry was one of the towering figures, and this one's a nice one. Any subject can taught to anyone in an intellectually honest fashion if we heed their level of development. And what he meant by that is if you want to teach math to 6-year-olds, if you want to teach calculus to 6-year-olds, you have to invent a mathematics that embodies the powerful ideas of calculus that is in the intellectual wheelhouse of a 6-year-old. You cannot do what most people do today, which is to try and take adult arithmetic, which is recognizable to adults, parents and teachers, and try to jam it into 6-year-old brains. You don't wind up learning math that way. And Seymour Papert, who among other things said the best way to learn French is to grow up in France, and the best way to learn math is to grow up in math land. What is a math land? Well, it isn't anything you'll find in most schools. So I'm going to base the talk on some of these ideas. Now, one of the problems, one of the muddiers, is there's so much concern about jobs and vocational training, and UCLA is one of the key offenders, actually. An enormous, at least in engineering, enormous amount of what goes for knowledge across the street is actually vocational training. It's not the same thing as a real education. It's about how to make a living. And this is a tiny thing compared to a few other things like citizenship. Think about that. Hey, we're not hunters and gatherers, hermits living in a fertile valley. That's when we worry about making a living. We're not the Alan Kay who won the Survivor thing by eating slugs. That's not me. And whatever school is about, it seems to be failing. If this election where we are right now seems to be any indication. But in fact, 1/3 of native-born Americans cannot get 6 out of 10 questions right on the standard citizenship test, which, believe me, does not test whether you're actually fit for citizenship. It tests whether you know a few little facts out of 100 that you're supposed to look at. And I think we all have a duty to the next generation, whether or not we have children, because we live in a society that depends on a lot of different ages working together. And then there's this dimension of richness. We live in a state that got rid of this dimension of richness in the schools. Remember Prop 13? Anybody here? Man. Perfect example why you should not have referenda on important issues. That was a referendum. No way you should do it. So what we really care about here, I think, is the reason we're here is we want education to have something to do with making a life, and a life in the larger world. And I'm going to up the ante here because Americans tend to look at things not just locally, but from an American standpoint. And so I'll just pop the Universal Declaration of Human Rights here as a context, a bigger context, signifying we live in an entire world, and unless we're going to embark on genocide in order to get more resources for ourselves, we're going to have to actually come to terms with where we actually are rather than where we'd like to think we are. And the problem is that we have a brain that was not set up at all by nature for doing thinking. And several cognitive psychology books point out that, in fact, our brain does everything possible to avoid thinking. It's actually energy intensive. It uses up glucose. And so our brain is really set up for reacting for the most part. And every once in a while, we can learn something. And in fact, most of the learning we've done have been in the last few thousands of years, even though we've been on the planet for about 200,000 years. So this is sobering. And yep, sorry, I have to talk about humans here because... So Humans 101, I'm just going to give you a couple things here. John will give you a few more. It's great to... I feel like I'm the lead-in for your talk, John. So just 3 things. Humans are basically Hamlet meets limited cognitive capacity. There's George Miller meets System 1. One way to look at it is our minds are theaters. We live in the stories we make up. It's a joy, but it is also our biggest snare and delusion because we tend to treat the plays that run in our mind as reality, and they aren't. Our capacity are tiny, and it's been downgraded over the years. Most things we have hardly any cognitive capacity at all, sometimes called cognitive load. And most of our thinking is actually not recognizably human. Most of the stuff we do every day is something that most mammals, for example, also do. So we're more theatrical than we think, we have less capacity than we think, and we think differently than we think. Why do we think these things wrong? Because we have stories that tell us that we're actually really smart. Remember England, the Sceptred Isle? It's a great song. So we treat our beliefs as reality. We can't take in the whole context, and we react rather than we think. So these are just 3 things out of several dozen, but they're context for what we have to deal with. And here's a good place. Everybody got their reality kit? Let me apologize for the people who stuck the thing together, made it so it's hard to stick, so please just tear it and open it. Okay, and so if you cover your right eye and you fixate on the plus and you just move it in slowly, right about here, something interesting will happen. Just do it slowly, right about here. What do you notice about that round dot? What happens? Goes away? Yeah, it absolutely does. And but is there nothing where the round dot was? No. What is there? Sort of like text, right? Kind of like this. How could that be? Think about it. That is not what is on your retina. How could it be? I just put you into a hallucination. You're hallucinating that text. And in fact, we humans are in a hallucination every waking and sleeping moment of our entire lives. That is the number one thing you have to understand about us. And here's what's going on. Our eyes are, strangely, for people who are supposed to be the top product of an infinitely wise creator, we have the worst designed eyes because the blood vessels are laid over the light-sensitive cells rather than sensibly behind them like a squid's eye. Think about that. And where those blood vessels enter and where the optic nerve retreats, there are no light-sensitive cells. So what happens over here is where most of our acuity is, called the fovea. And the fovea is, when we fixate on the plus, the fovea has got the plus going into it, and when we get to the right place, the dot goes into the place where there are no light-sensitive cells, and it winks out. But our brain knows better. It knows there's frigging text. And so just to help you along, it fixes up your dream to be what you know is true about the world. And it's doing that about every single thing that you think about. This is why we're so messed up. Okay? Anybody been to a surprise party for their first grade teacher or something like that? I just went on the internet and typed that in and found a YouTube video here. Oh, this is sound. That's okay. I will act it out. So she says, we're waiting here for Mrs. Flexer, your first grade teacher. And here she comes, here she comes, here she comes, here she comes. Now, what was that look on her face? Take a look. Yeah, it's not just surprise. She's actually frightened out of her mind. And a couple of minutes later, she's crying. And a couple of minutes after that, she reported, "This is the happiest day of my life." And what we're seeing here is what Daniel Kahneman calls System 1, which is a fast reaction to change. It's the one that prevents the future. And by the way, it happens whether or not you're prepared for it. So if you were to stand next to me to a door and I tell you, I'm going to slam this door right now, and you say, okay, wham! you're going to have this reaction. Because the part of you that knows what's going on is not at all involved in that reaction. So Kahneman calls these terms System 1 and System 2 expository fictions, which means they're totally composite of dozens of different mechanisms, but they're very useful because the System 1, we can think of all of the different kinds of mechanisms we have for dealing with things in real time. And System 2 is something that is more ponderable and slow. System 1 takes a long time to learn and is very quick to react, and System 2 can learn quickly but is very slow. Peekaboo works over and over again because of the door slamming thing. Now, anybody here besides cognitive psychologists know why Mrs. Flexer was so happy after a couple of minutes? Well, it's not just adrenaline that happens when you get one of these reactions. You also get dopamine and serotonin, which are basically opiates. Why? Because if you're going to fight your way out of something, you better not feel pain. And so you get doped up, and when you realize that, oh, it's not real danger, suddenly you're loaded with dope, your own dope, and you're happy as a clam. These kids did not get on the roller coaster expecting to die. It doesn't matter. You're manipulated this way all the time for good in the theater, for ill in political rallies. Okay. So here's another example. Here's a father and a son going through a System 1 reaction as the son learns to drive the car. Remember that? So I'm just going to skip past here. If you all remember that experience, remember it's like tunnel vision. You can't see, you can't hear what your parent is saying, you don't know what gear you're in, you can't see the stop signs. 6 or 8 weeks later, you can see the stop signs, you can hear what your parent is saying. Something has happened, something that is dealing with all of the real-time things you have to pay attention to. System 1 has learned something, and System 2 may have learned something also. We know that adolescents don't learn the slow thinking part of driving very well. They're about 5 times as prone to having accidents. So they're actually not thinking very much, they're just driving the cars. Now here, what we want to do is understand what does it mean to drive, say, a calculus car, or a systems design car, or the war avoidance car, the green revolution car, the invent the future car, the human car. And basically what's happened over the years, this is a simplification, but think about it. Schools have tended to stay with the System 1. That's traditional schooling is catechismic. Learn this, repeat it later. So it's basically about memory and recall. Quick reactions to things. Makes sense. If you've got a saber-toothed tiger coming, you don't want to be philosophical about how much empty space is in the atoms in that saber-tooth. You want to get up a tree. But the problem is that in the century we live in, we have to deal with both of these in some way. And generally speaking, one of the things that's happened that's interesting over the years, the reaction to System 1 teaching, the back to basics kind of stuff, has been System 2 teaching, cognitive teaching, but without the skills you need to actually think. Right? And I think every educator here is familiar with this thing. There's a tendency to look for one religion. The problem is it doesn't work out that way. Even learning calculus, there's a whole bunch of things you have to be able to do automatically in order to think at all about what the implications of calculus are about. And so I think this is one of the things that we need to think about in this conference. Schools love System 1, so we have to be careful. Every time schooling sets up to do something good, they usually start off with the right kind of ideals, as I'm sure you've heard in this conference. But what happens when the rubber hits the road is it quickly gets trimmed down to something like behavioral objectives, which is a system 1 phrase. Like, how can we tell what the students are learning? Well, we'll see what they can recall on a test. And there are gazillions of these. I just got these off the internet. Yeah, these are all biases that we have that are built into us one way or another. I've just got 24 of them here, or more like 50. And here's a plug for John Hattie's book, because I like to read what other people have written when I'm giving a talk. And so I read a couple of his books. This one I commend highly because it's extremely well written, it's brief, it covers a lot of cognitive biases and things. It's written for teachers. It's just excellent. And I checked with John to see if I could get him to agree that it's maybe only half of the things that could be in there, right? Yeah. We are a mess. And in fact, we're kind of like a cave person with a briefcase, if you sum all this up. And in that briefcase are a lot of baggage from the past, all this Humans 101 stuff. But instead of a spear, we've got nuclear weapons. And the same old brain, and so this is pretty scary. If you're not scared, check in with me later and I'll explain this to you. It's like, what about this is not scaring you? This is basically where we are. So the thing is that what's wrong with us has far larger consequences. This is why education has to wake up and quit worrying just about vocational training. It has to get into what's actually going on and what needs to be done. So what's a better context? Well, here's my colleague, Vi Hart, very talented artist and educator, and she said we must ensure that human wisdom exceeds human power. That's just a great sentence for what education is about. That's it. Ensure that human wisdom exceeds our power. And what that means is we can't try to take the old brain and extend it by external tools. That's the deadly part. The tools can't be out there. We have to get some tools in here, and that means we have to grow some habits that are not naturally there in the human psyche. Einstein's definition of insanity is a good one. Every educator should recognize that that's what's been going on. Every time, it gets relabeled, but it's basically the same bullshit that's completely missing the point of the centuries that we've lived in, the last 3 or 4 centuries. Okay, so here's a current fad, kind of perfectly exemplifies what's wrong. Hey, everybody should learn how to code. No, that isn't the right reason. If this is what is how it's aimed at, you'll get something worse than what you already have right now. For instance, if it were music, it's like saying, hey, everybody should learn scales. We can test how well you learn scales. That's a perfect thing for California state education, isn't it? We don't know how to test whether the person's a musician or not, whether they're getting musical, because we have to have musicians to make that assessment. We can't afford, we're not going to get musicians in as teachers. We'll do this without teachers who are musicians. And even in the rationalizations for it, it's mistaking logical thinking for thinking. So logical thinking is an idea that the Greeks had, and it was a big deal in the Middle Ages. But it completely misses the point about the modern age. The title of this conference completely misses the point about the model, because nothing interesting can be proven. That isn't, science is not about proving. Not even close. You can prove things in math. You can prove things in logic. But if you're dealing with the larger world, it's not about proving. It's about something else. We need to figure out what that is. So this is just another distraction. If this were a longer talk, I would give some demos of some alternatives to this. But let's just end this little part here by noting that public education tends to retreat to form. The first thing that goes is content and context. Like, what's the problem with teaching coding for all? Well, I'm linked in with most of the people who are trying to do this, and the number one rejection of almost any reasonable idea is, well, the existing teachers can't learn this idea. And so the curriculum we're going to come up with is not actually for the children, it's actually for what the existing teachers can learn and teach. If that isn't wrong, I don't know what is. Okay, here's a different context. Here are things that were invisible until a few hundred years ago. The universe itself, the fact that we live on a planet. Most people still don't realize that. That they don't. Society is actually a system. It's an arbitrary system. Different societies have different systems rules. We live in the middle of technology. That's a self-portrait of the internet. And we are systems. Not just physical systems, but also mental systems. So these contexts are some of the contexts we have to worry about in the 21st century. What are those? I don't know of a single elementary school that teaches any course in systems. You might. I've looked. One of the exceptions of a teacher who is trying to get systems into schools is Irene Lee, who's now at MIT. You can check her out. And what's computing for? Well, computing is the languages for these new contexts. That's what it is. It's like it's not worthwhile really teaching English unless the larger context is the ideas that are the reason for having literature in the first place. You've got to start with what's important, and there are some details that then can be learned. So it's about science and systems and society, not simple algorithms. It's the simplest thing. Just reject it if you can't find that context, because you're just in the middle of people who are either well-meaning and naive, or people who are not well-meaning at all but are seeking to cash in. Get rid of both groups. This is not a new idea. Almost 400 years ago now, 1620, so 4 more years will be 400 years, Bacon wrote a book called The New Instrument for Knowledge, Novum Organum, and he did the same kind of complaining that I am. I thought about doing this talk just out of this book. It's a great book. And his 4 main culprits were we're screwed up as species, we learn badly as individuals, our languages can't represent ideas very well, and what he called theater is what we call culture. That is, our culture is made up of stories which we act as though they're real. And he said, for crying out loud, we need new ways to get around what is wrong with our thinking. Show me an elementary school in the United States that is dealing with what Bacon pointed out 400 years ago. This is one of the foundations for what we call science. I've avoided the science word until now because most people think science has something to do with atoms or galaxies. It isn't. Science is a set of heuristics for getting around with what's wrong with our brains. It needs to be used everywhere. Okay, now, it's often fun when you like something. I want to learn how to play guitar. I used to teach guitar a long time ago. And, well, you need it's really tough to learn all by yourself. You need a little bit of expert advice, a little of it, lots of practicing by yourself. It's really, music is basically social. You want to play with other people. You can fill in anything. How about learning language? Same deal. And 8 to 10,000 hours. It's worthwhile realizing that even though we are wired genetically for language, it takes us years to learn because we're not wired genetically very well. We have a couple of genes different from the other primates that allow us to do something. Maybe sequencing is all we can do. Most of the content of most languages is actually inventions of the cultures over the years, and it takes many, many years for a child, maybe 5 or 8 years for a child to get fluent in their own language. And again, whether we like it or not, we've got system 1, there's all this technique that you have to learn, whatever it is, and there are things where we really want to think about. It's no fun winding up being a musical robot, and there are some that people have incredible technique, but they can't phrase worth a bean because they're not actually responding to music, they're just playing notes. But here's the problem. The problem is, what if you want to learn music, but the system says, no, you got to learn how to read. You have to learn science, you have to learn math. These are obligatory things that the society has decided. Now you've got more strikes against you. You don't even give a shit. I don't want to learn this stuff, I want to go play guitar. Well, take the baby to France if you want them to learn French, and they're not going to complain a bit. Because genetically, we are set up to learn what's in our culture without any complaints whatsoever. This is a really important idea. And it doesn't matter. There's no such thing as wanting to learn French or not learning French. The environment transcends our desires. This is for evil also. Television is an environment. It's the worst possible thing that we could do to not put a Surgeon General's warning on it and keep children off it. The failure to do this means people do not understand the technology that they're actually living in any cognitive fashion. Well, 2 people who understood this idea from the beginning were Montessori and Papert. So Montessori said, look, the job of early school is to inculcate the most powerful epistemological ideas of the culture into the children as part of the environment. And we'll build it. We can't teach it in the classroom, but we can build it into the school. We can make an artificial environment, as indeed all of our environments are artificial. Yeah, and even here we have this problem. So the questions we need to ask today, what would it mean to grow up in system land? What would be a school that would embody system land? Because we don't want to teach it in class. That isn't it. What would it mean to grow up in equal rights land? Wouldn't that be great? Try teaching that in class. There's no way. This is one of the greatest inventions humans have ever come up with, and it's one of the hardest things to teach. You have to embody it. And the problem here is bootstrapping society. Like if you could miraculously do brain transplants on all the adults today, we would have no trouble with the next generation because they would be embodying this environment. The declaration isn't it. And instead of true or false or proving something, we negotiate meaning. That's what science is. Science is a negotiation between what little we can do in here and what's unknowable out there. Science is the thing in between. So it's not like old knowledge at all. Well, we could make a school. That's what Montessori did, and it was a good one. And guess what? They're hard. She did it partly by personally training every teacher for several years and vetting every single one. Montessori schools went down after she died because they weren't willing. And her idea was that the most important person in the school is the teacher who knows exactly what it is that is the epistemological framework and what it means for the child to want to learn without the apparent assistance of either the environment or the adults. So if you read her stuff, it's still as fresh and as good as it ever was. Hard to grow great teachers. This is an idea that doesn't scale. Socrates doesn't scale, but technology. When was I going to get around to talking about technology? Well, this is the technology part. Writing is a technology. You can tell by this is Carolingian handwriting, so this is a copy. If you know Greek, you can see up on top that this is the Phaedrus. See that phi up there? And it's through writing that we know about Socrates. He wasn't passed down by word of mouth. It was through writing. And here's something that most schools have forgotten. They're still trying to teach things, and that isn't the way it works. And what's cool is writing doesn't get all of Socrates. It gets a ghost. And that ghost is sufficient to allow an ordinary teacher plus the writing to do a lot of what Socrates could do. Isn't that one of the greatest inventions ever? And writing transcends time, space, and ordinary teachers. It didn't transcend the world because there are too many people. It's too hard to copy manuscripts. And so a couple of thousand years later, the printing press came along and it solved this other problem. Not just the teacher, but now the books are so cheap the students could have their own. They didn't have to learn in a social setting. Here's where new comes. New comes when you're not in some, get rid of Facebook. It's the worst possible thing because it is basically all about being a cave person 100,000 years ago. That is what it is. It's an automation of that. No. Got Socrates there, but now you've got a few brain cells to think your own thoughts. And what the printing press has done, the first invention of the Industrial Revolution, it led to most of the rest. It actually automated ideas, spread them around in great quantity for very little money. And we need to think about what that actually means when we're trying to figure out what our little idea is going to be. So here we are back to this, and now let's think about now, 30 years out in this context. Well, we still have that nice exponential curve. We got plenty of technological power. The Industrial Revolution is working for us. Well, here's an idea. Not just making a computer to do old media. That's the thing that's so disappointing to those of us who helped invent this in technology starting 50 some odd years ago. Oh, but that's where Gutenberg, it's Gutenberg Bibles all over again. Printing press was really for multiple points of view, not just printing Bibles. Took about 50 years. Aldous and Erasmus, for example, understood that. Most people still don't. Like schools. When was the last time your teacher gave you 3 books to read for a particular class? No, there's 1 textbook. Wrong. Get rid of it. So the next qualitative step here is how can you get a ghost of teaching into this replicatable technology in the same way that great writers could put that ghost into the technology of writing and printing. I want to say that very carefully. I'm not talking about doing a Socrates. I'm not talking about doing what a great teacher can do because there's all this motivation stuff. I'm talking about doing something much better than no teacher, much better than a bad teacher, much better than a mediocre teacher. And that is a reasonable goal because we have the past to rely on that, yes, we can actually bridge some of these gaps, and bridging those gaps will be significant. So I have to point out here that now was once back in 1958 to 1962. This is Not my idea. This is an old idea, one of the oldest ideas when people realized what computers are about. This was one of their destinies. And there were some brave attempts back then, but some combination of the scientists and the government weren't up to funding it, because this is a really difficult problem. It's a harder problem than doing personal computing and the internet. That took us 14 years to do. So we're talking about something that is not quite a Gothic cathedral, but we're talking about something that requires a will that spans decades and transcends administrations. Humans 101 always get in the way. But you know what? This now, 2016, it's a hell of a good now. We should get started on this and not put so much effort into all this other stuff, because the other stuff is just going to keep repeating itself as it has for the last 100 years. Let's try and invent the next real thing after the printing press and make it work for the great ideas in education. Thank you.